Hi. It's very nice to be back again, and meeting at what might be considered a propitious time, or maybe even a fortuitous time. If you watch Action News tonight, or for those of us who have cable, Channel 47, there's a man who's a mathematics professor who is going to prove with an equation the existence of God tonight. Two things very interesting about this. First of all mathematical equations have suppositions behind them. And do not forget about the ultimate supposition concerning causation when it comes to God, which is the problem of what's called infinite regress. That is, if God created all that's here, then who created God? And if someone created or something created God, then something had to create that. And if he can solve that problem, then I'll be happy to listen to it. Second of all is the problem of journalism, which around here is about as biased as it gets. If you're going to have a person who believes in God on, it seems to me that you owe your audience the chance to hear from somebody who can say, you know, this equation's not true. In fact, I just read a book 6 months ago full of equations and logical arguments for the non-existence of God. Second thing that's propitious about this week is that this church, of which many of you are members, has a new minister. And there are three things that I just love about our new minister. First of all, he's a lapsed Catholic. Second of all, he's gay. And third of all, he's a non-reconstructed hippie. He loves everyone. He's just wonderful. I'm so happy that you picked him. I have talked to him, and I'm going to go see him in an office hour. And my only concern is that he's so busy loving everybody that he doesn't seem to follow what I think ought to be the first rule of this church, which is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Joseph Conrad, in one of his books, begins his book by asking what to me is one of the great fundamental questions, and that is, what is the fetish of the moment? I take Conrad's sentence and turn it into a slightly different one. Who are the villains of the moment? And here in the United States, the villains of the moment are the Pope, the BP oil company and its sundry partners, and a man who tried to plant a bomb in Times Square and left his keys in the car. Now, 2 out of 3 of those are religiously connected. And when I came up with the idea of this talk in conversation with Carrie, I had no idea what I was getting into. In fact, I feel like Carrie has laid a Chinese curse on me. May you live in interesting times. There are many, many ways to approach this subject, one of which is historical, and do the history of religious crimes. Another one would be to study crimes among the laity, compare the criminals and their chosen religions with each other. And a third way to approach this topic would be to compare the crime rates among the clergy, which is also a very interesting way to approach it. There is, however, many problems no matter which way you choose to approach things. So what I'm going to do first is give you a little castor oil. It's not going to taste good going down, but once it hits your digestive system, it will be beneficial for you. And what I mean by that is, this is a scientific talk. And I have heard some people in this church give talks who tried to explain what science is. They did not know what they were talking about. And I thought I knew what science was until I started messing around in this literature. The problem is, I bought some things for you folks to see. This is one of the most biased sets of literature I have ever read. Because, as the man who wrote Why We Make Mistakes has said, you cannot approach a topic that has religion or politics in it with objectivity, because people make mistakes because of their biases. And that is especially true of deeply religious people who want to talk about science. They simply don't know what it is. They don't know what they're talking about. So, what I would like to do is tell you what science is supposed to be about. And if you disagree with me, that's fine. We can have that argument after the talk. Okay? Now, I'm dating myself here, but I'm an old bastard, so I can do that. All right? When I was a little boy, there was actually a commercial on television that was based on science. And this is what the commercial was about. Crest toothpaste said that if you brush your teeth with our toothpaste, you will actually have less cavities than if you brush your teeth with a toothpaste that does not contain fluoride. So, how do you prove that? Well, you have two groups of people. One is an experimental group, and the other one is a control group. The experimental group gets what's called the independent variable. That's the Crest toothpaste with the fluoride in it. The control group just gets ordinary toothpaste with no fluoride in it. And guess what? The people that brushed their teeth with Crest had fewer cavities. Now, is there a way to corrupt this experiment? Absolutely. 85% of the people that get cavities are between the ages of 5 and 15. You stick all the 5 to 15-year-olds in the control group, and boy, you're going to look great. If everybody else gets the Crest and they're over the cavity-prone age group. But that's what science is about. It's about not selecting biased samples. It's about selecting double-blind groups, control groups, and experimental groups. Also, you have your little handout here. I'd like you to take a look, and if you didn't get one, they're right next to Kerry. He's sitting right here in the front row. Either one. Just hand them both, because we'll use them both. We're going to get through this, Earl. You'll see. Okay. Now, when I was at Rutgers, the chairman of the department there told me that life is a normal curve, and that what you have in front of you is a normal curve. That means something like this. If a teacher gives a test to 100 students and grades on the curve, and you've probably all heard that expression, and you've probably all prayed that the teacher wouldn't grade on the curve, this is usually the result. If you give a test to 100 students, usually about 5% of them will make an A, and then the next certain percentage or so will make a B, and right in the middle where you see that little U, that's where the C's are, okay? And then further out on the curve are the C minuses and the D's and the D minuses and the F's, okay? So that's the way life works for many, many different types of phenomena. But life isn't all about a test in a classroom, is it? It's about a lot of other things. But when it comes to crime and when it comes to deviant behavior, the normal curve takes a big turn. Let me give you an example. 20% of the beer drinkers in the United States consume 80% of all the beer. The beer companies know this. And if you ever watch a sporting event, you can tell exactly who their commercials are pitched to and who that demographic is. Okay? Likewise, we know that about 20% of the criminals commit an enormous amount of all the common crime. In fact, let me tell you about one study. This was done in Miami in the 1980s by one of my favorite criminologists who unfortunately died a couple of months ago. His name's James Inciardi. Inciardi compared 573 criminals who were drug addicts to 429 criminals who didn't use drugs. The 573 criminals who did use drugs committed 215,000 crimes in 1 year, including most of the violent crimes. The 429 non-drug using criminals only committed 137,000 crimes in 1 year, and much fewer violent crimes. Now, there's been a debate in the literature for a long time, and to me it's a very useless debate, which is, what's the independent variable? Do you first start using drugs and then get into crime? Or do you start getting into crime first and then using drugs? Or do you get into crime and drugs at the same time? And the answer is, who cares? What we do know is that criminals, common criminals, who use drugs commit much more crime than criminals who are not drug addicted. So, this is one of the reasons we use science. Because we can measure things and we can predict things. Now, that said, it is also one of the reasons that we don't use religion. Science is a very good predictor of things. Religion is a terrible predictor of things. But you're not allowed to tell them that. Okay? That's called heresy. Let me give you a couple examples. In Isaiah 17, the destruction of the city of Damascus is predicted. Hasn't happened in 4,000 years. In Ezekiel, the death of all Egyptians is predicted. Still plenty of Egyptians around. And of course, in 3 of the Gospels, Jesus tells his followers that he will return within a generation and establish his kingdom. We've been waiting 2,000 years for that, those of you who are Christians. And of course, that prediction is made every dozen years or so. And the next time it's predicted to happen is based, of all things, on the Mayan calendar, and it's supposed to happen in 2012. And every time somebody predicts the end times, and it doesn't happen, there's always the same excuse. Only Jesus knows when it's going to take place. And so we hear this over and over again. And as for the book of Revelation, it has been studied from one end to the other by critical scholars of all persuasions, and most who are objective about it believe that it's very simple to explain. It was written for its time. The codes that are in it are extremely easy to explain, that Emperor Nero is the Antichrist, and so on and so forth. But of course, if you want to make a racket out of it, you bring it up to the present day and you say, yes, President Obama is the Antichrist, or it's Saddam Hussein, or somebody else who is the villain of the moment. But no, it was really written for its time. And you can see why, if you know anything about that time. The Christians were being attacked in the arena and burned, and yeah, I can see why they were mad at them, at the Romans. It makes sense. So, back to the subject. How does science work? It works by rules of causation. And this is where religious people go wrong all the time. There are 3 rules of causation. I had a slide about this, but the slides got messed up, so I'll just tell you what they are, okay? The first rule of causation is time order. That is, the cause, or independent variable, like the toothpaste, has to happen before the dependent variable. No cavities, okay? The second thing is, there has to be a real association between the cause and the effect. Now, if the cause is not real, we have all kinds of words for that, don't we? Okay? One of them is called the stork didn't bring you. And I'll tell you how that came about. They actually did a scientific study of this. I'm not making this up. A friend of mine wrote a research methods book. And in his book, he said, there were many people in the rural parts of Holland who noticed that in the spring, the early spring, the stork population greatly increased, followed by an increase in the human baby population. And so they actually had to send out scientists to prove that elsewhere in Holland, in the urban areas, there was no increase in the stork population in the spring, but there was an increase in the baby population, the human baby population, thus disproving the notion that the stork brought babies. When I was a young boy and my father wanted to talk about sex education, he came up and handed me a book called The Stork Didn't Bring You. And it had little diagrams of women in it, and hell, Aunt Wilma's better looking than this, so it was not a good one. But okay, you get the idea. There has to be an actual association between the cause and the effect. If it's not, it's called myth, it's called superstition, or deeply religious people call it, well, what is known as gap theory, which is anytime there is a gap, it must be the work of God. God gets blamed for it all, right? You saw the earthquake in Haiti, and many of the survivors said, God saved me, and I'm going to devote the rest of my life to God. Well, what about the 200,000 people who died? Didn't they love God as much as you did? Why did God take them and spare you? You're never given any explanations for that. So, one of the great mistakes that is made by many deeply religious people is no matter what happens in life, God causes it. That's a problem because they also have the devil in their theology. And sometimes they seem to mix up the two when it comes to causing evil or causing good. So, that's not my problem. That's their problem. My problem is when they start messing around in science. And I'll get to that in a minute. Finally, the third rule of causation is that if you have a hypothesis, like one's religion causes crime, you have to eliminate all other alternative causes, like poverty, biology, labeling theory, you know, like in Arizona where they can stop and ask for your papers. If you look, what is it called now? Probable suspicion, right? Never mind probable cause. All you have to have is probable suspicion. Nobody's been able to define that yet, by the way, except one state legislator who said you can tell by their shoes. That's what he said. I'm not making this up. So that's the wonderful thing about being a scientist. You don't have to make stuff up. All you have to do is watch the news. and read the studies. Okay, now, we are here tonight to discuss the relationship between two variables, crime and religion. One of the rules of science is that when you study something as a variable, everybody has got to agree on the definition of it. And those of you that are in the so-called hard sciences have a much easier time in doing that. If you're a chemist, you know what salt is, right? It's the formula for it is out there in the world. Everybody knows what it is. There are some things that are saltier than others, but at least you know what salt is. Nobody has ever been able to agree on the definition of crime. And that's one of the problems in this literature. Crime can be defined in any of the following ways, and has been and will probably be defined in even more ways in the future. I am a member of the White Collar Crime Research Center. One of the first things they had us do was come to the University of West Virginia for a 3-day conference on how to define white collar crime. And we finally did it on the back of a table napkin over lunch. I'm not making this up. All right, so here are the definitions of crime that get used. One is the legal definition, that which is against the criminal law. Many of these studies about crime and religion are based on juvenile delinquency. Many of the acts involved in juvenile delinquency are called status offenses. It means it's perfectly legal to do them after you turn 18, but if you're under 18, it's a criminal act. And then you see when religious people sometimes study delinquency, they add a whole bunch of acts that are not against the law. They just don't like them. They think they're immoral. So this is another definition that gets used, that which is immoral. Getting pregnant before you're 18 is considered an act of delinquency by some researchers. Running away from home after you're 18, that's called moving out. Okay? Before you're 18, it's called being a runaway. Actually, there's two kinds of runaways. There are kids who can't stand their family and just run away, and there are also what are called push-outs. People whose family can't stand them, and they kick them out of the house. So even the definition of a runaway is complicated. Some people think it's a delinquent act to have sex before you're 18. That gets thrown into some of these crazy studies. So I'm sorry. I don't mean to apologize for the social scientists or for some of the religionists who try to do scientific research. But the waters are muddy. The logic is irrational. And the definitions are screwed. And so that's what we're stuck with. Other definitions of crime, some people who are liberals think crime is nothing but a label that's attached to an act. Why should marijuana smoking be against the law? Why should prostitution? Why should gambling? Or as Carrie told me about the name of a book that I've also read called Ain't Nobody's Business If You Do. Another definition of crime that I think is fascinating is any violation of human rights. Well, who's going to determine what that is? If you don't have enough to eat, is that a violation of human rights? Some people think so. If you don't have health care, is that? If you don't have enough money to make your house payment? We can go on and on. Argue this forever. Second, the other variable we're going to use here is religion. That's very problematic to define. There is one study by the Federal Bureau of Prisons that asked all the people in federal prison what their religion is. Now, that's not a particularly useful piece of data if you're a social scientist. Anybody can say that they're this or they're that, but that doesn't tell us very much, does it? It doesn't tell us how committed they are to their religion. It doesn't tell us if they believe in their religion. It doesn't tell us if they pray, if they read the Bible. And by the way, only 24% of so-called Christians in this country have read the entire Bible.
What kind of students?
No. They're not students, they're Christians, period. Yeah. By the way, they did a survey of high school seniors who call themselves Christians, and over half of them believe that Sodom and Gomorrah were a married couple. I told that to Jay, and he said, I didn't know Sodom and Gomorrah got a divorce. But I digress. All right. So, anyway, what social scientists measure when they study religion is called religiosity. That means how committed are you to your religion? First of all, do you believe it? Do you really believe that there's God, that Jesus rose from the dead, was resurrected? Do you go to church regularly? Do you engage in other church-related activities? You know, like when they have a sale or a cupcake sale for the building fund. And if you've seen that movie about the black comedians, and you've seen the routine that the master of ceremony does, his mother had him go to church every single day, and he just ends up saying, Mama, I'd rather go to hell. That's just going every day. It's just, I can't take it anymore. And there are people who go to church every single day about something or other. And yes, it does help keep some kids out of trouble. It's really true. But the big deal is, what does the data say about religion and about crime? So, let's have a look. Except for one more thing. The FBI's measurement of crime stinks. Measurements of things are supposed to be valid, which is you're supposed to be measuring what the true definition of something is, and they're supposed to be reliable. Reliable means just like your car is reliable. Reliable cars start at sea level, they start up in the mountains, they start when it's raining, they start when the sun's shining, right? That's what you call reliable under all conditions, okay? Do you know what the FBI crime statistics are made up of? They're made up of reports to the police that the police perceive as actual crimes that have been committed. So, the vast majority of those crimes are what are called common crimes, which include crimes against property and violent crimes. Now, this is very interesting. Robbery is considered a violent crime. Now, if you're not home, it's called burglary. But what's the goal of the robbery? Is it really to be violent against somebody? Yeah, it's to take some of your money. So robbery, in fact, is at least partially a property crime. But the FBI classifies it as a violent crime. And by the way, that's the crime most people are afraid of. So, here's what I'm trying to tell you. The FBI measures street crime, common crime, very little organized crime, very little white-collar crime. What's the news yelling about today? About the most harmful things that are going on in society? The Gulf of Mexico is being completely polluted. That's not going to show up in the FBI statistics. The Pope, who has material knowledge of the greatest sex scandal in the history of the Catholic Church, will not come and testify. Why? Because he's such a holy man? No, because he's the head of a country. Catholicism is not a faith. It's a nation state and a bank. And by the way, on the list of money laundering institutions, the Vatican is number 5 in the world. Okay, you get the idea. This crime statistic stuff is meshuggah, as my people say. But let's go back to the issue. What about common crime and religion? What do we know? Well, we know that there have been thousands of studies. Many of them have been of delinquents. Many of them have been of people who are in prison, which is unfortunate because there are certain unique characteristics about people in prison. So, one of the things to do today that is very popular is to do what is called a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is when you go and read a whole bunch of studies about one topic, crime and religion, let's say, and you find out what the correlation is between a person's religion and crime. Now, I want to read this to you because I think the people who put it together did a very nice job of describing the problem with it. Much of the literature on crime and religion is church-inspired, probably deserves about the same level of credence as drug company-funded research showing their blockbuster drugs are wonderful. Much of it is published in very weird journals. One philosophy professor reviewed a 2001 meta-analysis of the literature that shows all the usual blindness of meta-analyses. Oh, you don't know what meta-analysis is? As usually practiced, it's a way of doing math instead of thinking. First, you find all the published articles pertinent to hypothesis X. Religious people commit fewer crimes. Then you combine the data using, depending on your taste, either simplistic or suspiciously fancy and hidden assumption-ridden statistical techniques. Finally, voila, you announce the size of the effect. Bayer and Wright reviewed over 100 studies about delinquency and religion, and they found the correlation, which is an R statistic, to be minus 0.11. What does it mean? Does being religious make you less likely to engage in criminal activity? Despite the a priori plausibility of the idea, the conclusion is negative. The median effect size of religion on criminality means that half of the published studies found the correlation close to zero. No effect whatsoever. Second, that's half the published studies. Many of these studies had so small sample sizes they shouldn't even have been included in this meta-analysis, but were. And the smaller the sample size, the more likely the study was done by the backing of a religious organization. And the smaller the sample size, the more positive the effect of religion was. Imagine that. So, what you have here is a very questionable assumption about the nature of the benefits of religion on delinquency. Now, when Carrie and I had our original discussion about this, she said, I know you're a scientist, and I don't want you to do anything that's biased, but see if you can actually find out if us atheists and agnostics are really as morally terrible as our critics think we are. See if you can find something good about us, but with evidence, objective evidence. So here's what I did. First of all, if you study the divorce statistics, you find out something very interesting. Certain Christian groups have been found to have divorces that were caused by adultery, substance abuse, physical abuse, and verbal abuse, and abandonment. Whereas the number one reason cited for divorce among the general population is incompatibility. And one of the groups with the lowest divorce rate in the United States, and by the way, this was just admitted by the minister of Chet's Creek School, are atheists. We have a very low divorce rate, even though Jock Soskus and I both belong to this same organization. Okay. Second, numerous studies have found a positive correlation between childhood sex abuse, obsessive-compulsive disorder, bipolar disorder, and high religiosity. So there is a high correlation between obsession and high religiosity. Bipolar sufferers sometimes exhibit high religiosity, extreme religiosity, as a secondary symptom of their manic phase. Now, believe me, that is preferable to what other manic people suffer. They go on shopping sprees, or they act out sexually. So I don't think obsession with religion is too bad compared to those other things. But anyway, there is even a Christian website that teaches bipolar believers how to distinguish between fruitful religiosity and spirituality and that which is caused by their manic phase. So I found that interesting. And that comes from, you got to read this book. This guy has a website. His name is Dromedary Hump. He thinks he's a camel. And his website is called The Atheist Camel, and he's published a little book about his thoughts, and it's fascinating. Okay. In 2007, a man named Gregory Paul did a study of public opinion polls in Europe and the United States. And he came to the following conclusion. The more Christian a place is, the greater the social ills and crime in that area is. That's the primary conclusion of Paul's article, which was published in the Journal of Religion and Society, which is housed at Creighton University, which is a Jesuit school in Omaha, Nebraska. Now, the religious people criticized his article, said that one of the reasons you should not take this man seriously is because he's a paleontologist, as if paleontologists can't read public opinion polls. All right. But what he found was that the most Christian parts of the United States, the South and the Midwest, have the highest rates of social ills and crime, including murder, sexually transmitted diseases, mortality rates, youth pregnancy, marital and related problems, than the Northeast, where social conditions, secularization, and acceptance of evolution approach European norms. The study also showed that the United States as a whole has a far higher rate of crime and social ills than the rest of the developed world, including all of Europe. Now, when it comes to violent crime, we are the kings of the developed world. Our violent crime rate is 10 times all the European countries plus Canada and Japan put together. Okay. Now, I ran into another criticism of the crime statistics that a religious person made. And I'm not making this up. I swear this was his criticism. He looked at all the violent crime statistics and all the common crime statistics and said, well, you see, this is the problem. If you just take the African Americans out and you just take the Hispanics out, then the United States crime rate is about in the middle of all the developed countries in the world. And it seems to me, as I was reading this, that the guy is brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. All we have to do is deport about, what, 35% of our citizens, including the President of the United States, and the crime rate will go down. Now, interesting aside, nobody has ever figured out what makes crime rates go up or what makes them go down. In fact, one of my idols, my criminological idol, is at George Washington University. And his view of this crime rate thing is very, very straightforward. I don't believe them when they go up, and I don't believe them when they go down. Forget about it. They're just not reliable. Now, what causes crime? There are as many theories about that as there are flavors of Baskin-Robbins ice cream. And we could have a 5-day conference on that. And so I don't want to get into what causes it. But I will tell you this. If you look at the entire population of federal prisoners, 80% of all the people in federal prison are there on drug charges. That should be a hint. And in the other study that I told you about that NCRD did in Miami, the gateway drug to illegal drugs in almost all the cases was alcohol. Not milk, not marijuana, alcohol. So, if you want to find the link between religion and crime, look at the religions who use alcohol the most, who view alcohol as a beverage and not as something to be used during rituals. And that, to me, is one of the links between religion and crime. Now, this will get me into maybe some trouble, but I don't care. I want you to know that I'm a veteran of the United States military, that I've been a citizen of this country all my life, and that I consider myself a very loyal American. So don't go tell me to live somewhere else if I don't like it here, okay? People have done that. It's not going to work. Here's the thing. If you look at the population of federal prisoners, you find something very, very interesting. 24% of the population of the United States is Catholic. Almost 40% of the federal prisoners are Catholic. That is true both in the United States and in the United Kingdom. Now, there are a lot of people who have worried about this, including Catholics. And so they've tried to explain why Catholics are so overrepresented in the prison population. And one of them has said, well, we used to be able to blame this on poverty. But guess what? Most Catholics aren't poor anymore. And they're still going to prison. So, they researched it a little more, and here's what they came up with. Catholics are very overrepresented among alcoholics, among strippers, among prostitutes, among other kinds of sex workers, and tend to engage in professions that are related to crime. Nobody knows exactly why this is, but they do know that there is a terrible drinking problem among large groups of Catholics. I have a quote in here from a former priest who remembers one Christmas Eve, he and his wife went to pick up their car at a garage. Car came up to the ticket window, and the man at the window was dressed in a very nice suit. And they commented on him on his appearance and said, how are you tonight? And he said, well, it's Christmas Eve and it's 9 o'clock. That means I have 3 hours to get drunk before Mass. And they ended up in his parish canceling Christmas Eve Mass because so many people came in drunk. That's how widespread this problem was where this man lived. Now, this is not scientific sample. But when a priest starts complaining about his own parishioners, and also, he said, drinking among the clergy, the Catholic clergy, is very, very serious. There are many alcoholic priests as well. That's a problem. And it may be linked to the reason that so many people, or so many Catholics, are overrepresented in the crime statistics. Now, in response to your request, here's some happier news. There is a sociologist named Philip Zuckerman who spent 14 months in Denmark and Sweden. Why is that important? Because these are two of the most atheistic countries on earth. Only about 20% of the populations of these countries believe in God. The first thing that Zuckerman noticed when he arrived in a town in Denmark that had 250,000 people was that there were no cops. None. In fact, he went 31 days before he saw any policemen at all. The total number of murders in this town for the first year that he was there was one person. The Danes and the Swedes don't even believe in the notion of sin, yet their violent crime rates are the lowest in the world. Nobody goes to church or reads the Bible. Are they unhappy? A survey of happiness of 91 nations ranked Denmark the happiest country on earth. Zuckerman noted that while Denmark and Sweden are societies without God, they are not societies without religious ritual. The majority still pay 1% of their annual income to support their national churches. They get married in church, baptize their children in church. Most still think of themselves as Christians, but they don't think of themselves as Christians by faith or spiritual conviction, but out of a cultural sense. It's unthinkable to most couples not to have a real wedding in a white dress in an old church. I don't want to list all the statistics on Denmark and Sweden, but basically only about 20% of the population of each country believes in a personal God, considers God to be important in their lives, and believes in life after death. In fact, most of them believe that life is meaningless, but are very happy about the whole thing. He interviewed one nurse, and he said, you work with dying people, don't you? She said, yes. And she said, and he asked her, who are the people that seem to you most afraid of death? And she said, the people that are most anxious about death are the Christians. Why? Because there's heaven and there's hell. They have anxieties about which place they might end up. Anyway, what about the health of these godless societies? By every measure of societal health, life expectancy, literature rates, school enrollment rates, standard of living, infant mortality, child welfare, economic equality, gender equality, health care, lack of corruption, environmental protection, charity to poor nations, crime, suicide rates, unemployment, Denmark and Sweden are at the very top of the lowest rates in the entire developed world. And this from countries where people do not believe in a personal God. So, it is not true that you need religion for morality. Our animal ancestors exhibit altruism. We didn't invent morality. It's a product of evolution. Now, let's talk about some other crimes in religion. Do you know at this moment, if you go on eBay, you can buy a pair of Jesus's Levi's. I'm not making this up. I had a whole slide for that. Okay. Here's some other things that you can buy that are for sale as religious relics. And by the way, this has been going on since the Middle Ages, as Jay well knows. The relics of Pope, You can buy the leisure time clothing that slaves wore during the ancient times. You can even buy vials of blood, snot, and other bodily juices, if you care to. And then, of course, there are the famous splinters from the cross that Jesus was crucified on. And there is, if you want to see this after the talk, feel free. There's a whole measure of splinters that someone has worked out, including the volume and the mass and the splinter sizes. Anyway, there's enough splinters, relics of Jesus' cross available to make 1.5 Noah's Arks, if you care. Okay. Now, other relics that you can buy: complete Holy Grails, broken pieces of the Holy Grail, thousands of them, nude pictures of Mary Magdalene. I'm not making this up. Interesting, since the camera wasn't invented until the 19th century. Fake original Bibles. Most of these are the Da Vinci Code with a fake cover on it. The real beard of Moses, and a 1978 Ford Cortina, once owned by God. You may also purchase used panties once belonging to the Virgin Mary. There are hundreds of these that are owned by churches across southern England and the American Bible Belt. All true. Okay, now let's talk just for a moment about the people in federal prison once again. 83% of the people that are in federal prison are either Christians or Jews. Only 0.2% of the people in federal prison are atheists. So the incarceration rate among atheists is extremely, extremely low. Now, why am I telling you this? 2 reasons. One, there used to be a TV show, and I think there still is, called America's Dumbest Criminals. Right? And I used to show an episode of that to my students because I wanted them to help me come to a common definition of what dumbest meant. Okay? And on this episode, there was a man who robbed his own bank, okay, on Friday. And then on Monday, he came back with the money and tried to deposit it in his own checking account. Okay? There was another man who disguised himself with whipped cream. And he stood in line with the other customers in order to rob the bank. And while he was standing in line, all the whipped cream melted off his face. And of course, the teller was in hysterics by the time he got up to her, and that already pressed the alarm, and the police were on the way. Now, everybody agreed that these people were dumb. Okay? Now, what we concluded was that they were amateurish, that they didn't know what they were doing. Okay? Now, one of the popular theories about crime is that it is a rational choice. But 80% of the prisoners are there on drug charges. Have you ever seen anybody on drugs? Did they look rational to you? Did they look like they're able to plan their crimes rationally? Are they able to plan an entrance? Are they able to plan a stick-up without screwing things up? And there's 50 ways to screw up a crime, is the old saying. And the other thing you have to plan if you want to pull off a crime is an exit. That's what pros do. Okay? So, most of the people that are in federal prison are very poor. They're too poor to afford their own lawyer. And the studies show that if you can afford your own lawyer, you're twice as likely not to go to prison. Okay? So, the problem is if 80% of these people are in there for drug-related reasons, they're not very rational to begin with. They suffer from low intelligence. So this is another factor that is greatly related to criminal activity, is low intelligence. And I know some of you aren't going to like to hear this, but one of the factors that is related to high religiosity is low intelligence. Absolutely true. This was something that was noted in the ancient world by the pagans, and it's been tested over and over again in our era. In fact, 96% of England's Royal Science Society and 93% of America's National Academy of Sciences members are atheists. So atheism is very highly correlated with intelligence, very positively correlated with intelligence. Now, the other reason I told you about the federal prisoners is that there was a religious person who looked at this data that noted that 83% of all the people in federal prison were either Jewish or Christian, and his claim, or counterclaim, was that this data is a conspiracy. Yes, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, a noted hotbed of free thought activity, sent out a conspiratorial letter to every warden of a federal prison in the country and said, alter your statistics to make sure that over 80% of the people there turn out to be Christians or Jews. And the Jews are only something like 1.7% of the prison population. And by the way, Jews are very overrepresented in one kind of crime, and that is they're incarcerated for white-collar crime, way out of proportion to the general population. There's something like 2% of America's population, but 17% of the white-collar criminals that are in prison are the Bernie Madoffs of the world. Okay. Now, one of the things that is true is that there are many religious conversions in prison. And these people have been studied repeatedly. And guess what? They convert because they think it'll help them sway the parole board to let them out early. And it does happen. And there are a lot of false conversions. There isn't anything we can do about that. And by the way, one of the religions that is most frequently converted to in prison is Islam. Okay? And not just any old Islam, but black Muslims, who believe that the Jews control the media and the banks. And so it's not a very rational religion, unfortunately. Okay. As I was saying to you before, there are a lot of myths about crime and a lot of myths about religion. And I would like to dispel one of the central myths about terrorism right now, because this is a crime that's on a lot of people's mind. Voltaire said that those who can make you believe in absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And the myth is that most terrorists are fanatics. Now, stop and think about this for a minute. If you're a member of a group and you've captured somebody and you want to elicit information from that somebody, and in order to elicit that information, you want to torture that person, who's the best person to do the torturing? Now, this is anti-intuitive, because you might think of me as somebody who enjoys torture. No, study after study has shown if you let the sadists loose on people that you want to elicit information from, they'll kill them. What you want is an ordinary person. Somebody who thinks it's okay to torture people, but not enjoy it. Not to do it to the point of killing them. And there have been hundreds of experiments that some of you have probably read about, Zimbardo's and others, that have shown if people think they are given permission, just ordinary people, to torture other people, they will do it. And this has been shown to happen over and over again. So it isn't just fanatics
who are willing to engage in atrocities. That's my point. So here's some of the literature. The Abrahamic religions, with the Koran and the Bible, have taught their members to hate opposing gods. The Israelites are described as being commanded by God time and time again to wage war and kill non-believing pagans. And if you read the Old Testament, you'll see genocide, ethnic cleansing, time after time after time. Because the God of the Old Testament is a very jealous God who doesn't want anything to do with people who worship fake gods or other gods except Jehovah. A long series of biblical condemnation set in motion the wheels of a series of religions deeply hostile to all other religions. Christianity began as a very tolerant religion. The first Christians, the Gnostics and the, I don't want to mess this word up, Ebionites, accepted that their religion was just one interpretation of the truth amongst many, or that it was a devout personal path, not something that could be forced on other people. But the New Testament is a completely different story, and this is something that our minister needs to know about. As Jesus himself tells the Jews in John 8:44, "You are the father of the devil, and your will is your father's desire. He was a murderer from the beginning." If anybody wants to read what I think is the greatest book about Christian anti-Semitism, try Constantine's Sword, written by James Carroll. He concludes that the Jews have become not just the historical enemy, but the ontological enemy of Christianity, the negative against which every positive aspect of Christianity is defined. Even now, it's against the law in Germany to deny the Holocaust, but there is a bishop in England who is a Holocaust denier and will not take it back. Anyway, what happened with Christianity is that Constantine became king of the Roman Empire. There were so many pagan religions that nobody could agree on what and where and how to worship anything. And so he imposed one religion on the entire empire, and it was Orthodox Christianity. And anybody who believed otherwise got their head handed to them, literally. Okay. An article published in Psychological Science looked at the relationship between aggression and recent exposure to accounts of biblical violence. Students were asked to read a story about the torture and murder of a man's concubine and his tribe's measured response. They assembled an army and razed several cities, killing every man, woman, and child and animal they could find. Half of the students were told that this story was based on an ancient scroll recently discovered by archaeologists. The other half of the students were told that it was from the book of Judges in the Old Testament, which it is. In addition to the scriptural distinction, half of the students from both the Bible and the ancient scroll groups read an adjusted version that included a sentence in which God commanded his followers to take up arms against others and chasten them before the Lord. Higher levels of aggression were measured in those who had read the violence was sanctioned by God. Unsurprisingly, this effect was greater in believers than it was in atheists. So atheists are less likely to engage in torture even when they are authorized by a religious document. Anyway, the same is true of Muslims. If they think that the Quran authorized them to engage in terrorism, they actually are acting on the belief that they will and their friends end up in paradise with 72 virgins. That's the belief out of which they are acting. I didn't say this was rational. I'm just telling you what the findings are. Karl Marx, the philosopher, was once asked, what is the most forgivable human trait? And he said, gullibility. And you see it in religion over and over and over again because of its irrationality. You remember the sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway a couple decades ago? The man who did that was a member of a religious cult that believed that human beings had bad karma, and that if he could just kill them, he was doing them a favor because their karma was going to get worse. And he got this idea from studying Christianity and Buddhism. Finally, I thought we could make up the handout for this, but the journalist James Holt has an entire list of religious crimes that have been committed over the 2,000 years of Christianity, including the murder of 3.5 million Jews before the Nazis came to power. One of these I just want to tell you about. During the 30 Years' War, it began in 1618. This one's after Luther pounded his 95 Theses on the cathedral. The population of Germany went from 18 million to 4 million in a war between Protestants and Christians. Christians have killed each other more than anybody else has killed them over this fight of what a real Christian is. Very sad. And by the way, our Puritan ancestors, who later became the founders of this church, used to burn witches at the stake. And so I'm glad they changed their minds about things. But the one crime that has more debate about it than any other in human history is one of the most recent, and that is the Holocaust. And I heard this debated on Bill Maher's show just last night. And one of the things that people don't know about Hitler is that he was a baptized Catholic all his life. And there was a documentary on the History Channel just last month that showed the church that he attended in Austria. And just above the altar in that church was a swastika. That's where he got the idea for it. And who was the first nation, foreign nation, to recognize the Nazi regime? The Vatican was. They conducted a concordant with Hitler. And here's what they agreed on. Hitler agreed to leave the Catholic clergy alone if the Catholic clergy agreed not to engage in politics and stop speaking out against the Nazi Party. And that was part of their agreement. Hitler also taxed all the Catholic workers and sent that tax to the Vatican. Second, the man who was Secretary of State at that time of the Vatican and later became Pope Pius XII asked Hitler that if any Jews had converted to Catholicism and married Catholics, that they be left alone. And Hitler agreed. The Vatican was quite aware of what Hitler intended to do to the other Jews. And the Catholic Church did not ask for mercy for any of the other Jews. And the point still debated to this day is whether or not the papacy protected the Jews. There's books that argue each way, and I'll let you sort out that literature. One book I would like to mention to you is by D.J. Goldhagen. It's called Hitler's Willing Executioners. Goldhagen is a professor of political science at Harvard. He went to Germany to do his doctoral dissertation and interviewed the people who actually worked in the concentration camps during World War II. What he expected to find were Nazi fanatics who were drug addicts, psychopaths, sociopaths, etc. What he found out is that they were just ordinary German people that had been conditioned by centuries of anti-Semitism. Martin Luther wrote a book called The Jews and Their Lies. Luther gave the Jews a chance to convert to Lutheranism, and when they didn't do it, he got all pissed off about things. But if you've ever read any of Luther's writings, you know that this guy just didn't believe in the devil. He actually had conversations with the devil. And he always saw the devil when he was sitting on the toilet. And he always threatened to fire the devil or defecate on the devil. And by the way, the greatest book I have ever read about the history of the Middle Ages is called A World Lit Only by Fire. It's by the same author who wrote the biography of Joseph P. Kennedy, William Manchester. And he talks about what it was really like to live in the Middle Ages. And if you go see Robin Hood, you'll see a little less romanticized version of the Middle Ages. But we have romanticized this period to death. Most people didn't even have last names during the Middle Ages. That's how little the self mattered. Most people never left their villages, and if they did, they couldn't even find their way home. And nobody let the average person know what was going on with the papacy. Next year, there's going to be a series on Showtime about the Borgias. This was a pope who had an incestuous relationship with his own daughter, and his daughter also had an incestuous relationship with her brother. The Borgia Pope used to have orgies in the Vatican, and he would give away prizes to the men who had the most orgasms with prostitutes. They would gather up the 100 most beautiful prostitutes in Rome and bring them into the Vatican. So this is where Mario Puzo got his idea for The Godfather. The book The Godfather was from the Borgias, not from any historical source other than that. Finally, I want to just briefly mention sexual crimes by the clergy. It is real easy to stand up here and pound on the Catholics and say, only the Catholics abuse little children sexually. And it's not true, even though they're going through a worldwide scandal. And priests in many different countries are resigning. And of course there's Cardinal Law, who was involved in the sexual scandal in Boston in 2002. By the way, you know where he is now? Yeah, he's in the Vatican. He's a member of the Curia. He gets to vote on who the next pope is. And he is implicated in some of these sexual crimes. Now, every year there are 260 members of the Protestant clergy who are reported to be involved in sexual abuse. How do we know that? Do the Protestants keep good statistics on sexual deviance in their among their own members? No. You know how we know that? From insurance statistics. Now, the problem is that a lot of Protestant churches are actually street setups. They're just corner stores. Many of them don't have any insurance. So we don't know what the real story is. Now, I was kidding Carrie at one point, saying to her that Jews don't do those kind of child abuse things with children. They launder money, and they embezzle and things like that. Well, I have here a list of 109 rabbis, and if you want to see this, you can. Over the past century, who have sexually abused Jewish children. One of them teamed up with the mafia and sold Jewish young girls into sexual slavery. So the Jews aren't innocent either. And I just don't want you to go away thinking I pick on the Catholics. It's all of the clergy that's been involved in this sort of thing. Then there are the televangelists. And I have a whole list of these guys, and I don't want to read them all because there's too many of them. But what is very interesting about the televangelists is what they get in trouble for. Did any of you ever read the book called Don't Call Me Brother? Okay. Don't Call Me Brother is about the Jim and Tammy Baker scandal. The guy who wrote it is a former circus ringmaster. So you can imagine how lively it is. And he lost his wife during this scandal, so he's doubly angered. by what went on. It's really interesting when people on the inside of something write a book. They usually have an axe to grind, and that's okay if they grind it in the right way. What he found was that homosexuality among the televangelists is extremely widespread, and that a lot of the anti-homosexual rants coming from the televangelists are really a function of what's called identification with the aggressor. They have grown up hating themselves for what they are. And so we're going to see an awful lot of this continuing down the road. The one person I want to tell you about, of course, is the man who in the past few weeks the late night comedians have had a field day with, and this is George Rikers. Remember him? Yeah, okay. George had his picture taken at an airport, the Miami airport, by the Miami New Times. And George was going on vacation in Europe, and so he called up a internet service that was called Rent Boy. And he rented himself a male prostitute named Lucian and took him on vacation with him. And this is a man who actually claims to be able to take homosexuals and straighten them out. And he claims that's why he rented Rent Boy, to do that. Well, when Rent Boy got home, his name is Lucian, he was told by one of his friends who this guy was. He's a very high-ranking member of, I think, Focus on the Family? One of the far-right religious groups. Well, Rikers denied having sex with Lucian. But Lucian went on television and said, oh, no, we had sex a lot. In fact, his favorite thing was to have me rub his body. And he even described what he called the long stroke that the man enjoyed having Lucian perform on him. So, that's one thing I learned about televangelists. The other thing I learned about the televangelists is that when it comes to crime, one of the things they are most often in prison for is false faith healing. This is one of the biggest rackets in the history of Christianity. Many times, this is Elmer Gantry's stuff. You'll see people in wheelchairs who will get up and walk. They're planted there. Happens all the time. Now, do people with real live conditions ever get better through faith healing? And the answer is yeah, and they also get better from sugar pills. The reason is the mind is able to do some really interesting things to itself. And placebos work, and sometimes faith healing does too, but it's purely coincidental. It's not a real treatment. Now, I read in preparation for this talk a number of books about how to have a spiritual experience anytime you want to, how to speak in tongues anytime you want to. These are written by former ministers who are now atheists, and they will be able to teach you how to do this if you so choose. There's nothing to it. It's a very human thing. It's not otherworldly at all. Finally, I would like to just mention for 5 minutes white-collar crime and organized crime and the clergy. There is a Catholic priest whose name is Randall Raddick, and he has written a book called Gone to Hell. And this is what he found out. He likes really expensive cigars and really expensive wine. So he embezzled money from his parish. And when he got out of prison, he started to wonder if any other priests have ever embezzled money from their parish. So he looked into it, and he found a study from Villanova University. And what the study concluded was that 85% of the parishes of the United States suffer from embezzlement. 85%. 11% of which were over $500,000. And so, picture a priest who gets $2,200 a month in a parish full of Mercedes-driving Catholics. he feels deprived. He feels entitled. And so, of course, he's going to do that. Now, two Notre Dame political scientists did a study involving the hypothesis concerning states that have a high degree of religiosity and political corruption. What did they find? The state in the Union with one of the highest degrees of religiosity has the highest rate of political corruption, Mississippi. So there is no relationship between religiosity and corruption whatsoever, except if you want to draw the opposite implication. And it would take a study of all the states to do that. Right now, as you probably know, the other villain of the moment in this society isn't even in this society. It's the Mexican drug lords along the U.S. border. They are now using religion to get their members to commit murder, claiming that they will be forgiven by God and that God wants them to do this. So it's just like the Crusades. The saying during the First Crusade is, you go kill a Muslim for Christ because God wills it. That's what these drug lords are now telling their members. Now, my favorite white-collar crime scandal involving a rabbi happened in 2009. His cousin ratted him out. His name is Rosenbaum. This man would get a body part for you for $160,000. Now, if you've ever gone into Panera's to buy a bagel, they have a little sign that says, these are our schmears. A schmear is something you can spread on a bagel. Well, that's what he claimed he was. He was the king of the schmears. And for $160,000 schmears, he could buy you a kidney if you needed it from Israel. A lot of activity with the Russian mafia comes through Israel because there's a lot of Russian Jewish people who've immigrated. Anyway, these guys involved in the human body parts scandal made illegal campaign contributions to mayors in New Jersey, and mayors in New Jersey in 3 cities ended up going to prison as a result of the body parts scandal. Finally, I would like you to know one more thing. The way the mafia got started was during the Spanish Inquisition. The Catholic Church did not want to be responsible for torturing anybody. And I got this during a trip to Milan, Italy. This is all the devices they used during the Spanish Inquisition. And I'll pass it around in case you want to have a look. You could just pass it on in case you don't. And this is a picture of the Iron Maiden. They used to make people sit in this thing, and they never were same again. There's a thing in here that looks like a juicer that you put your head in, and they lower and turns your teeth into a substance like mashed potatoes. This is what happened when religion ruled the world, ruled Western civilization. This was called the Dark Ages, and it was not for a joke. There was a reason for it. I want to conclude this talk just by suggesting a few things that we ought to be concerned about on the basis of this topic tonight. The minister that was here in January suggested that we ought to have some rituals. I joined this society to get away from that. My idea of a free thought ritual is a book talk, a discussion. The minister who was here said that we're not going to be invited to any ecumenical meetings at the White House. Great! I don't want to be at any ecumenical meetings. I want the people to leave me the hell alone. Okay? Last time I read the Constitution, the First Amendment was still in it. It promises not only freedom of religion, but freedom from religion. And as long as the other people who believe leave us alone, I think that's what we ought to be satisfied with. Now, there's a whole bunch of atheist authors who are just mad as hell about religion. Including, of course, Bennett and Dawkins and Hitchens. Now, I've met Hitchens. He's mad at everybody about everything. Okay? I wish I could write like he does. He's got the gift of gab. He's brilliantly educated, all the rest of it. But what do you think would happen if we started writing into the Times-Union saying, you know, you religionists are really full of crap. And we think your beliefs are nothing but superstition and mystical stuff that you made up and myth. I don't believe that. I know people that are very nice people, very moral people that are religious. And as long as they mind their own business and don't start attacking us and depriving us of our civil rights, fine. I got no problem. Now, the problem with the minister that we just hired is, it seems to me, he needs to speak out against evil. He needs to speak out against extremism and terrorism. And not just have a love-in every Sunday morning. And I think we ought to remind him of that. We also ought to remind him that not everybody in the Unitarian congregation is a believer. There's a man at Harvard named Epstein who wrote a book called Good Without God, who has recommended that atheists start holding religious services, including weddings and funerals. Okay? My problem is I don't feel spiritual when we sing hymns. I don't get a spiritual feeling out of being in church. I feel spiritual when I fuse ideas together, when I write, when I give talks to people like you. And this project has given me a really nice opportunity to engage in this kind of endeavors, and I really thank you for letting me address you. Thanks.